Hi everyone, welcome back to the third episode of The Lit Corner, the podcast presented to you by Skillet Readers, where we seek and celebrate stories. My name is Poorvaja,
And my name is Srilakshmi, and we're
and we
Skillet Readers.
and we are thrilled to be presenting this podcast to you. Thank you so much for all the love and appreciation you've shared for our past two episodes. And this one is a special episode because it's just the two of us speaking about a topic that we often discuss, books. On account of Independence Day, we are here to really think about what freedom means to us through the lens of children's literature. Now, many of you may feel like, oh my God, another podcast on just the independence movement. And we hear you, right? But we do think it's an important topic for us to speak about, especially considering the state of the world today. However, we are trying to bring this to you in a fresh format. So, today, while we think about freedom, we really want to examine what all freedom could mean. It could be freedom, of course, from oppression, but it could also just be freedom to think, freedom to buy what you would want, freedom to go where you would like to go, freedom to read what you would like. So, freedom can mean very different things for us, and that's what we'll be exploring today. I'm going to ask Sri Lakshmi, which is the first book you think we should really bring to light here?
So I can't think of one book in particular because in our Skillet Readers programs, we've explored quite a few. And of course, we'll talk about them today. But the first book that came to mind was Andamans Boy by Zai Whitaker. And this story is super interesting simply because it brings to light the perspective of the indigenous community living in the Andamans. So, in particular, the Jarawas. So, this story is about a boy who runs away to the Andamans and all of the challenges and all of the adventures he has. But I thought it highlighted the struggles and challenges of the Jarawa community and what are freedoms to us, but not necessarily freedoms to another set of people, which I thought was really interesting. It opened up my mind.
That is such an interesting example, Sri Lakshmi, because if someone were to just read the blurb at the back of the book, one might see this as just a story of adventure, right? It's a story of a boy who ran away from Mumbai and made his way to the Andamans. Why
Right.
are you specifically recommending this book when we are exploring it through the lens of freedom?
Right. I think the point that really comes across very, very strongly in the book is a marginalized community's perspective, which we don't read about too often, and certainly not in Indian children's fiction. And while it may not be set during the freedom struggle itself, freedom is also not guaranteed to everyone in present day, right? And the degrees of freedom also are different to different people. That's why I wanted to talk about this book.
Yeah, very well put. And I think another thing that really struck me from what you're saying is also around what mainstreaming means, what culture means, who decides how much freedom we have to define how we want to live our lives. That's a fantastic recommendation for sure. What about other books?
Yes. So there's one more fiction book called Train to Tanjore by Devika Rangachari. And this is part of the Songs of Freedom series, which is an excellent series for middle school because all of these books are set during the time of the freedom movement. And this particular book, what I liked was that it was set in the South. I think that South India's role in the freedom movement is not something that I grew up reading about in textbooks, forget in fiction books. And I think for a long time, many of us grew up thinking that maybe this didn't even really affect the south of India, which is wrong. And this was also interesting because it is based on the author's father's experience in the freedom movement, particularly, I think, during the Quit India movement. That's another book that I'd like to recommend.
Now, interestingly, both of these books that you've recommended so far are fiction. And before we kind of get to your third recommendation, why is it powerful for us to read about fictional stories about the independence movement? Isn't it just enough for us to read the autobiography of all of these leaders at that time?
It's harder to be transported to that time because factually, it's a little drab. So when it's fiction, we get to live it through the eyes of another character, and we get to hear, see, smell, taste everything that the character is experiencing. And I think that's a far more interesting approach, like putting yourself in the character's shoes, which I think a lot of these books are helping with. It's also cutting through a lot of the maybe factual, I mean, it may be based on facts, but it's not presented to you in that way.
One of the things I always felt as a child, even though I loved history, was how maybe boring it was in classrooms to sit through it. But then when you actually read it on your own, you found it so fascinating. So maybe it's a suggestion to educators out there. If you are covering the independence movement, perhaps consider the books from the Songs of the Freedom series, because it also tells you a child's perspective of the independence movement, which is often let go. Having said that, you do have a recommendation for us from the non-fiction genre. So, do you want to share a bit more about that?
Yes, this book is by P. Sainath, and it's non-fiction, but it's a graphic novel. And so a bunch of illustrators have collaborated on it. It's called The Unknown Stories of India's Freedom Struggle.
Fascinating to read about the independence movement through illustrations and through graphic novels, right? Is there anything else you want to add before we go to other recommendations?
No, but I was curious to hear what your picks were. So tell us.
Great. I have two picks to share with all of you. I'll start with the first one, where we are taking the perspective of freedom and independence, but with the caste angle in mind. Now, when we are taught about history in school, a lot of us, I think, are still taught about the dominant upper caste narrative around history. And reading this book, which is Ahimsa by Supriya Kelkar, really forced me to look within. One of the most beautiful things about this book was that it was told from the perspective of a 10-year-old, and a 10-year-old who had to confront the fact that her mother participated in the independence movement, not as much her father. So, first of all, you're bringing in gender into the mix. Then you are really challenging the idea that Dalits came later in the movement, and Dalits didn't particularly have the same way of approaching things. And I don't think we heard enough about this. We heard about Ambedkar in terms of, oh, he helped us with the constitution. But what about all the role that he played earlier in the freedom struggle?
Yeah, I would agree. I also think that it's an easy read, but it's also not an easy read, and how it kind of struck this balance between the two. And I thought it also was very relatable because you will find that a lot of us who speak out against discrimination are also met with a lot of pushback from the older generation. And yeah, that's a fabulous recommendation, Purvaja. Do you have another recommendation for us?
Yeah, so when you mentioned the Songs of Freedom series, there was one more, incidentally also based in South India, called A Melody in Mysore, written by Shruthi Rao. Why I am recommending this book is also because it looks at the role that music played in the independence movement. We've heard a lot about these speeches, these words that moved all of us. But music can actually move us even more sometimes. It can cross barriers, it can cross language divisions within the country. What is the role of the gramophone? Like the fact that the gramophone became the symbol of the freedom movement. And again, to hear this from a 10 or 11-year-old child in Mysore. And I think Mysore specifically is fascinating because the kingdom of Mysore had a more friendly relationship with the British at that time. So I also thought it brought in a really fascinating piece of history to the mix. And the fact that there was a whole family involved, there was also the very interesting notion of this girl trying to discover what her place is or should be. So, beyond just a historical book, I thought it was also a great book in self discovery. If you have children who are in their pre-teens and they're trying to find out their voice, what do they speak out against or for? Both are equally important. I thought this is a great book to generate conversations on that front.
100%. I resonate with you there. And I think it's quite lovely to read a child's perspective from this time in history, because this is something I feel that textbooks can't capture. So, for those of us who grew up reading about this in our history textbooks, it's mostly, I mean, to me at least, it's memories of memorizing facts for a test and maybe the subheadings I made in my notebook. Like one subheading that I still remember is the Kakori conspiracy case, but I have no idea what that is. I don't have a memory of reading about it and really understanding it, because it's just a mix of dates and events and things that happened. But these books bring in so much richness and depth to that time in history, and you get a sense of what the struggle meant in the freedom struggle, as opposed to just reading about it and saying, oh, okay, let me write that in the in the test. So
Also, hearing you speak just now made me remember one more recommendation, which is a slightly different interpretation of freedom. So, if we now think about the freedom to live right now in the world today, economic discrimination plays a equally important role, right? Like the fact that we have vast income inequity in our country. So, another book that came to mind for me was this book called Mahalakshmi Will Go to Mysore. And it has, if you read the title, even if you read the book, maybe the first thing that comes to your mind will not be the understanding of freedom or independence, but just hearing you speak about the struggle, I also wonder what the people who fought for our freedom will think of the way we live today. Have we truly achieved the kind of freedom we want to? And in this book, there's a girl, Ira, who really wants her best friend Mahalakshmi to be able to come to a class trip to Mysore, and Mahalakshmi is unable to do so because of economic difficulty. So the story follows the two friends trying to figure out how this is going to happen. But I was just thinking about what would those people think of the state of our country today. We've made progress in many, many ways, and in many ways we haven't made progress. So hearing you speak about the historical context, I just wanted to bring in the fact that maybe it's still alive even as we speak right now.
yeah, absolutely, Purvaja. Thank you so much for sharing these recommendations today.
All right, so we've come to the end of our episode. Our personal appeal to educators, to parents, to anyone, to any adult really who's in a position to maybe encourage our children to really explore history and what it meant. Check out these books, see if they call out to you or your child. They are really great books, and we've used them, many of them, in our programs, and we've had a huge level of engagement from the children. So please do recommend these books to your children, get it for them, read the book, and more importantly, engage with the book yourselves and have great conversations. But thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you had a great time listening to us. Please leave behind thoughts and questions. And you can also use this opportunity to share a little bit about any other books or movies or pieces of art that you would recommend to our listeners. So leave behind comments for us. We will see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.